Another tool I think that would be really valuable for the companies is essentially to junk their terms of service around content and re-articulate them as rooted in human rights law. So this is where I'll say just basically a concluding word here. So basically, the companies now, their rules are all oriented around their terms of service, which are essentially contract. And it's really essentially about the discretion of the companies to determine what can be on the platform and what cannot. So that puts them in a relatively difficult position when it comes to governments that say, well, this isn't about our law, but we don't like this content for whatever reason. It would interfere with national security or public order. We want you to take it down because, by the way, it's inconsistent with your terms of service. So what does a company do in that situation? They could evaluate their terms of service and say yes or no. It's up to them. It's their discretion. Normally, it's going to be very hard for them to say no to a government, and that's legitimate, right? And that's also something we should not be surprised at. Governments want to have control over their own jurisdictions. I mean, that's how government is jealous of its power. I mean, that's the way the world works. But when the companies go back to these countries and to these governments, it's not a real strong argument to say, you know, our terms of service say this. This is about our business model. We can't really take this down. It wouldn't work with our business. But if they were able to go back to countries and say, look, part of our role here is to protect your citizens, to protect our users when their freedom of expression is interfered with, that at least raises the stakes for the country. I am not naive about this. It's not like a country like Turkey is going to say, oh, wow, human rights standards, sorry, we didn't mean to make this demand of you. But it will create a kind of layer, and we've learned, I mean, I think this is something we do know, that any bit of friction between the demand for a takedown and the company response, like any bit of friction there can actually slow down the process of censorship. It might not always work, but giving them that tool I think would be really important, and it would give us a tool to make demands of the companies and governments, which I think many of us and many of you perhaps in the internet freedom community have been making over the last several years, which is we want the companies and governments to observe the human rights of their users. 10 years ago, this would not be an issue, right? The companies were not that powerful. We lived in an age of a blogosphere, right? Where you go from blog to blog, from link to link to link, till suddenly, how did you get there? You don't know, but it was a curiosity, and you enriched yourself, and you had access to information and all of that. Everything is centralized now. It's centralized on these few platforms. They've become ripe for censorship, whether it's from governments or it's from companies that are moderating huge amounts of public space. And it's an environment that we need to get a hold of very quickly. We need to be debating this. We need to have this at the center of our discussions around what the future of freedom of expression should mean in the digital age.